A Black Friday deal. This podcast is 100% free. Spread the news, man. Oh, hey. CNF is going to hold a little placeholder here for the 2025 Power of Narrative Conference held on the final weekend of March. Let's look up the website. Let's do that. Beep, 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 beep. Okay. Website is calmbeyond.bu.edu. And you just toggle around, find a menu, do something, and you can learn more about the Power of Narrative Conference. I've struck up a promotional partnership exchange of sorts, and there will be a discount for enrollment for podcast listeners coming soon. I went to this conference several years ago, and if you're a journalist, even a fake one like me, it's pretty awesome. And by fake one, I mean I'm just like a shitty journalist. Also, it's that atavistian time of the month. Already? It feels like Mira Potassium was just on, but no. It is a new one. I know. So if you'd like to read the story first, visit magazine.atavist.com and consider subscribing. I don't get any kickbacks, so you know my recommendation is true, bruh.
You kind of need to go, you need to be a truffle pig and go find all of those great little concrete details. And your story actually can only be as good as the details you find. So.
Oh, hey, CNFers, it's that $5 bill you found in those jeans that don't fit you anymore. Hey, and it's also the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the tales they tell. We've got Kate McQueen this week, and her Atavist story takes us to Nazi Germany. Yay! But she tells the story about the journalist Carl von Ossietzky, who was imprisoned for being critical of the new administration, you know who, and Germany's rearmament. Then a cohort of journalists and colleagues got creative and figured the best way to break Carl out from captivity, or out of captivity, would be to get him nominated, for the Nobel Peace Prize. And if he won, how could Hitler and his goons possibly keep Carl behind bars, especially when Nazi Germany still tried to curry favor with the more upstanding democracies of the time? The story unspools from there. Pretty great. Show notes to this episode and more at brendanamara.com. Hey, there you can read snappy blog posts. Yeah, the blog is back, baby. Screw Substack and fuck social media. And sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Book recommendations, book raffles, CNF and happy hour, vegan celebration roasts, you name it. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. Hey, you know what? I do this shit for you. If you have feedback about the podcast or the newsletter, I aim to serve. So by all means, email the show, creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com. And I'll try to improve. Forever a work in progress. Batting leadoff is Jonah Ogles, lead editor of this piece. So we dig into his side of the table a bit. Parting shot, turning in my book, False Summits, feeling more sad happy than happy sad, and maybe that's just sadness. Here's Jonah, riff. For you, at what point do you start to notice, you not your eyes glazing over, but you've been in it so long that it's no longer fresh and you're having a hard time seeing things anew?
Yeah, you can almost track it along with the number of revisions that have been done, like just which equates to like the number of times that I've actually read the story, because your brain, you do a first pass on the story and you flag a bunch of like major issue, like the big stuff. The stuff jumps out at you when you read it the first time, and then you start addressing them. And on subsequent revisions, you're still focused on those, and then you start. Maybe this is just me, or maybe it's how everybody's brain works, but if there's a paragraph that I haven't really had to mess with because it wasn't the problem, I think I just start reading that a little bit faster. you get to a graph and you're like, oh yeah, that one's fine.
Yeah.
And so you just plow through it to get to the next thing and make sure that's working. And there may be an issue there, or something that doesn't quite line up with the stuff that you've been working on before or after that. If I've done like really like at the third like heavy round of editing, that's when I'd start to lose sight of what's happening in a story. And an example in this one story is I sent I sent it to Sayward, and she came back with the question, so why exactly was he worthy of the Peace Prize? Which I was like, oh my gosh, of course. Like it's not like that required a rewrite or anything. It required the addition of like 3 sentences in 3 different spots. But I had just kind of lost track of that part of it as we tried to get everything else clicking in the story.
Yeah, and those degree when you're paying attention to so many other things, and then you get those fixed, then you start noticing things elsewhere, and it becomes this like editorial whack-a-mole in a way. It's just things just pop up, and eventually you do have to just be done with it. But it's almost like you can almost never stop tinkering because things pop up here as you address another thing, and because your attention was elsewhere, and then now that that's been solved, your attention now can catch something else, and it's almost like, oh my gosh, like if it weren't for the deadline, we could just keep going around the drain on these things.
Yes. I mean, I don't remember who said it, but there's some famous quote about art isn't finished, it's abandoned. And I think that applies to long form journalism like this. And thank God for the deadline, because you're right. Like and certainly writers could tweak endlessly, and editors could as well. So luckily we have this moment where we just have to publish, and you say, okay, it's, this is as good as we can make it in the time that we have. But that's one of the reasons why it's so important that there are so many different eyes on it. I do think there's a balance to strike there, because I've gone through phases in my career in magazines where, with larger staffs, where you have so many people reading it, making comments and saying, I'm confused by this, or this line doesn't land for me. And I think you can reach a point where you start to sort of cut into I don't know if it's the muscle is the right metaphor I'm looking for, but the piece starts to lose a little bit of that life and energy that comes from, a writer having written the thing in kind of a pseudo flow state, or whatever writers get into as they're working on it. So I think you do want to be careful about how many cooks are in the kitchen, adding stuff and taking things away. But for the most part, it's really good that I read a story and get it as good as I can make it, and then Sayward reads the story, and then we have really good fact checkers who are reading the story with a totally different mindset than ours, than the editing mindset, and a copy editor who's reading it with his own way of looking at the story and making sense of it, and that protects all of us. It makes the story better. It finds weak points, and we have a really good working relationships at the Atavist. And there are times where fact check or the copy editor or me or Sayward will have an issue with one particular thing, but no one else does, and we stand down. Like that. It's helpful to have the group of us to be able to bounce the story back and forth.
Yeah, you bringing up the too many cooks in the kitchen, it kind of reminds me of TV shows where they're getting too many notes from studio executives and everything. You hear in horror stories about getting all those notes, and it dilutes everything to this mush, this gray mush that doesn't have any creative pyrotechnics. it regresses to the mean, which is never a good creative space.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you hear like bands talk about this as well. Like I remember listening to an interview with Krungbin, um, and they were talking about how like the third take of the song is kind of the sweet spot because it's still fresh. There's still energy to it, and but if they keep recording it and they do 10 takes, all of a sudden like they're making predictable choices. They're settling into like they're just taking it easy on themselves,
Mm.
and playing what they played on the previous 5 takes because it sounded really good. And that's not a perfect analogy for the writing process or editing process, but I do think there's something there that the more times you do it, you start to lose some of that. I don't know if it's resonance or power, but something that sort of animates a story.
A lot of people I've been talking to, I feel like there's been an uptick of people that I've spoken with on the show who have been really leaning into fiction as a means of refreshing, turning over the leaves for themselves and getting creative. And you're someone who loves a good thriller novel and stuff of that nature. And what are some good works of fiction that can really help a writer of nonfiction, just be more skilled at what they do with the verifiable facts?
Well, I mean, I'm fairly omnivorous when it comes to my reading habits, or I try to be, because I think I remember a long time ago being told that if you want to be a writer, you need to be a reader to do it. Just read as much as you possibly can. And as it turned out, I really didn't want to be a writer, but I did like being a reader. So, uh, I think you can pick up tricks from any genre of fiction and any writer. But I often, when I need a palate cleanser, I usually go back to either Elmore Leonard, who I just think is an absolute master of characterization and dialogue. His ear is just kind of unrivaled. And also John le Carre. I'll pick up basically any book he's written. Like the Patricia Highsmith books are great. She's known as a master for a reason. Dennis Lehane, his novels are really good. I always go into his novels thinking that I'm going to get like a real thriller, and they are, but they're really intimate novels. Like
Mm.
his characters, you really, really get to know them, and that's huge. I mean, one of the most common notes I give to writers is that I'm just not close enough to this person yet.
Mm.
Like I feel like I'm maybe watching them do a couple of physical things in the world as the plot moves forward, but I don't feel like I'm in their head, or sometimes I say like on their shoulder, but I want to hear what they're hearing, hear what they're thinking, see what they're seeing, feel like all the senses I want to be lighting up in my brain as I'm with this character. And Lahane is really, I think, really good at that.
And with nonfiction and reporting, what are some telling characteristics that just help you get to know a character more and immerse yourself more with a real life character? Like taking Carl van, am I pronouncing von his last name
Von
correctly?
Ossietzky.
Osinski, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So like someone like him, who's the central figure of Kate McQueen's story. It's yeah. What are some of those things that get you on his shoulder and immerse you with him?
The things I usually highlight in a story for writers are moments where emotions are running high. It can be anger, it can be grief, it can be excitement or sadness. Whatever it is. If there's a moment where they are going through it. That's when I want to spend a little more time with those writers. And I think like podcasters, I've heard them talk about like good tape, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's the same thing. And a lot of that is just I need more words here, you know, and sometimes the writer is able, to talk to a source and draw out more of their feelings about that. But in a story like this, where our sources are no longer living, or the characters are not, we have to look at what we can get in the documentation, and the writer has to do some of that like literary work and put themselves in that person's shoes, and as fairly and accurately as they can try to help translate to readers how this character might have been feeling in this particular situation. And we did that. This was an interesting one because Carl von Ossietzky, if I'm saying that right, uh, is sent to a concentration camp by the Nazis, and he writes letters, but they're going through censors, so the letters aren't all that revealing. So he almost like disappears in the story, which is a strange thing because it's all about him. And all the attention shifts in the narrative to Walter, who's, I forget her first name. This is one of the things about editing a story: when you refer to someone by their last name
Yeah.
for like a month and a half, you forget their first name.
The woman Jonah is referring to, her name is Hilda Walter.
But Walter became the character that we had to get closer to, and we had her letters as well, and we had people's recollections of interacting with her. And so we did lean on Kate, to just help her. We wanted Walter to feel more alive and more three-dimensional as a character. And a lot of that's just like devoting more words to it, and you do the best you can with the sourcing you have.
And early in the story, Kate writes, and this is something that Ossietzky, echoes, is that journalists, he believed, ought to hold a mirror up to the times and be the conscious of the day. But when you've got a sort of a rising right-wing authoritarian government, this can be quite literally life-threatening. So I don't know, maybe you can just speak to the courage that the people central to this story had and expressed at a time when Hitler was on the rise.
Yeah, I mean, it was. Kate and I never really talked about this, but Sayward and I did, about how strange it was to be editing this story at this particular moment in
Yeah.
American history. We assigned it, and we sort of knew there could be some resonance with current events. But when we scheduled it for November, we thought, well, with a little luck, it'll lose all that, and it didn't. I know, this is really, the whole story is about the courage that it took for Ossietzky to make the decision he did to publish stories that he knew the government was going to be unhappy with, and that the government was one that would take action as a result, and B, not leave Germany when he could have. He was made aware that he was on an arrest list and said he would stay a little longer, and then is arrested before he can leave, and sent to the camps, and has to leave behind his wife and his, I think she was 12-year-old daughter at the time of his arrest. I mean, I can't imagine doing that. Like, I don't know that I would have the courage that he had, but it's obviously very important that some people do. That people are willing to continue important reporting and report the facts, even if it doesn't align with sort of the power structure around them.
Very nice. Well, Jonah, it's always so cool to get your side of the table and how you're thinking about these things. So just thank you so much for your time, and then we'll kick it over to Kate now.
Thanks for having me, Brendan.
Nice. All right, we've got Kate McQueen, okay? And she was kind of nervous to come on the show, which was kind of charming. But she did a wonderful job, brought great energy. You would never know she was nervous. I know what it's like to feel nervous when you're used to doing interviews and then you become the interviewee. Yeah, but she talked about how research is like being a truffle pig, which to me was like the single greatest simile or metaphor I've ever heard on the show. She's fluent in German, and she's over in Europe right now researching a book that draws much of its inspiration and content from this Atavist story. For her day job, she's the editorial director of the Pollen Initiative, and much of her work involves championing or bringing prison journalism to the fore. And by that, I mean she empowers inmates to be journalists within the walls of the prison. It's wild. And we touch on that a little bit, but I plan on having Kate back in 2025 to talk about it in greater detail. She specializes in literary journalism, yay, with narratives on crime and justice. She has a PhD in literature from Stanford University, so she's like wicked smart kid, and a master's in journalism from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Now she's just showing off. Her work has appeared in Alta Journal, Next City, and now The Atavist. Why wait? Here is Kate McQueen. Huh.
Yeah, it's maybe helpful for me to explain a little bit about my split personality first. So professionally, I do have one foot kind of in academia or have for a long time as a researcher and as a critic, and slowly have put my foot in the world of journalism as well. And now mainly I work in prison journalism, which is probably a story for a different time.
And it will be a story for a different time, because once Kate and I were off mic, we agreed that she has to come back and talk about the prison journalism that she does. And well, there's going to be a little more chat about it, but there's going to be a more specific chat about it, probably in 2025. Okay, all right, back to Kate.
But my PhD is in German studies, and my primary area of focus as a critic is the early 20th century German language press. I came to him partially through more general research I've done in that area. The German press, it might sound very niche, but it's actually quite fascinating since, the modern press did grow out of democracy as a political system and to a certain extent influenced its rise. But, in a country like Germany, we had a very weakened democracy and ultimately a dictatorship take over. So the question about what happens to the press in that kind of situation is super interesting. And Germany can offer us a lot of interesting stories about what happens to journalism and to a free press when you have a weakened democratic system.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. And are you seeing just through your research and, of course, your reporting and writing of the story that it's something of a crystal ball that looking into the future and like seeing certain structures, and especially here in America, certain things are under threat?
I don't know if I would say crystal ball necessarily, but obviously there's always a lot of interesting things you can learn from history. The German democratic system was very young in the 1920s, and so they were under a lot of different pressures than we are in the US. But I'm sure a lot of people will read this story and feel a certain kind of affinity towards these exiled German journalists who are trying to figure out how they can sort of still maintain their homeland and their country and their language and keep a connection to a place where they no longer really feel that they have a lot of say in anymore.
Yeah, there's something to be said, and what's kind of cool about it, almost like these journalist superheroes, and like trying to free one of their own who is just savagely tortured, really, in in a concentration camp essentially. But yeah, so what for you? What was the appeal in trying to flesh these people out who are desperately advocating for one of their own on the inside?
I just really admired them. It's easy to admire Carl von Ossietzky, and he did later ultimately become a pretty well-known figure in German contemporary history for his sacrifice, I guess you could say, his willingness to stay in Germany even when the writing was on the wall, and everyone else around him, and probably he did too, knew that things were going to go south. His willingness to stay and say, "I'm going to share the fate of the country that I'm going to fight for," was very noble. But I also found something very noble in those who left and still wanted to try and make a difference, by doing everything they possibly could, really moving heaven and earth to save this man's life.
Yeah, when I see a journalist of that nature, be it in the past or contemporary, and how brave they are, I deeply admire that because I feel like I'm kind of a wimp when it comes to that kind of thing, and I I wonder for you, like what do you see in them, and what do you find so admirable, and like do you see some of yourself in them, or do you see something you wish you had more of in them?
Well, I definitely see something I wish more of us had and more of us were willing to plug into. I especially admired the two women at the center of the story, Hilda Walter and Hedwig Krünike, and just the creativity with which they tried everything they could to move the needle and make a difference. And when one thing didn't work, they just tried another thing, and they just kept going. So that I think is also just really interesting to see unfold in the story, is how resourceful they were.
With your reporting in your research, what was just an early, when you started pulling back the layers and everything, like when did this story really start to kind of take root or really like, kind of bloom for you?
Well, a lot of the things that I find interesting about the German press probably aren't interesting to a general audience. It's a lot of people often sitting around, probably in their armchairs, talking about situations, and there's not a lot of action. But this story, once I sort of began to realize all the things that were involved for this Nobel Prize campaign, it seemed to me to actually be something that could be plot driven, a plot driven historical narrative. And so that was when my interest really got piqued, and I thought, oh, this might be something that a publication even like the Atavist might be interested in. Journalists often, as you probably know, the work we do is not super action driven. It's a lot
Yeah.
of sitting around and thinking and trying to piece things together.
Take us to what you're thinking in metabolizing of material. To what extent do you just pour most of your attention into that side of the coin?
With a story like this, that's I mean, I guess you could call it reported. It's a lot of archival research. It's primarily archival research. You just have to sit down and read a whole bunch of stuff and build the story world for yourself first. Maybe that is helpful. I guess ultimately it can also sometimes be distracting because you can get distracted by, the atmosphere and larger context. But I think for me, that was how this really started to take shape, was thinking about the entire world that these people were in. So their milieu, and what was Berlin like, and what were these early camps like, what was Paris like, and trying to understand the sort of pressure cooker that they were all under.
Oftentimes, when we talk about world building, we often think of fantasy and novels that take us to a different time or whatever, and we don't often talk about the world building that goes inside of a nonfiction story and cultural context and just that the ecosystem through which these characters are navigating. So, just what was the world you were trying to build for this story?
Well, a big part of it was trying to imagine the way in which these cities changed, when the governments of their countries changed. And a lot of those changes were really abrupt and pretty dramatic. Part of the problem too with a historical narrative is, especially in the German context, because so much of Germany was destroyed in the war, is that most of these spaces don't really exist anymore. So you don't even have the possibility of going and observing in person what the space could be like. So an example of that is the concentration camp Esterwagen, the last camp that Ossietzky was held in. It's not really there anymore. There's a little bit of the moors. There's a very nice memorial, but the camp itself is gone. It can be nice, and I went and visited and thought maybe that would be something I could lean on, but it turned out that actually photographs were much more useful to me. But pretty much this entire project grew out of the archive and my
Right.
imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because you don't have the benefit of, interviewing principal figures too, to give you some, what do you remember? What is the context of this, and have them provide reflection on it. So that is its own kind of challenge. So just in your research, how did you still try to make it feel alive when you have to pull all those details from archives, from letters?
Yeah, that was one of the biggest challenges with this piece, because not only are there no people around to talk to and very few spaces to visit that are still sort of intact, a lot of Berlin was just utterly destroyed in the war. And so a lot of the archival material that could have been useful is gone. Most of the characters in this story were refugees. And so, they fled Germany with very little, then they fled France with very little, came to the US probably with not much more than a suitcase. So they didn't carry their letters or their photographs and these sorts of things with them. So the archives that still exist that are relatively robust are primarily collections that they had the foresight to store with a university or with some other institution in a neutral space before they left. So, for example, one of the collections that Hilda Walter put together of her work, her PR work, if you will, for the Nobel Prize campaign, she left in Amsterdam with the Institute for Social History. And another really important collection of letters that I leaned on heavily in this piece is at the University of London in Rudolf Olden's papers.
A moment ago, you were talking about how this story started to have the building blocks of plot driven historical narrative, and what were some models that you've read and you've leaned into and loved, and or be it books or magazine stories that this story that you're reporting on started to take on the feeling and the energy of, and you're like, oh, I can really lean into this thing, and these are the things that kind of inspire me.
I think I'm inspired most by biographers or writers of history that actually use a bit of criticism in their work, like Janet Malcolm or Claudia Roth Pierpont, which ended up being a little bit of a false model for the Atavist because they don't really do criticism. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say if anything was that I've read that is kind of close is maybe, David Gran. Not that I can say my work is anything like his, but he's someone who I admire enormously for the way he can tell a historical narrative that moves fast and still has depth, but that doesn't get too bogged down in the author's thoughts, I guess you could say.
When I spoke to him last for his most recent book, The Wager, we talked about how he's able to how he creates suspense in these historical narratives that take place sometimes centuries ago. And if you want to go back and listen to the two times that David Grand was on the show, one was episode 99, whoa, and episode 366, to dig into how he goes about these historical narratives as well. Really, really, really good stuff.
It's great if your letters, your letter writers can give you that kind of internal process. I don't know. I have to go back and listen to that interview with him. I don't know what his experience is like with that, but one of the other challenges I had with this piece was that Hilda Walter, in particular, but almost all of these journalists were just very much no nonsense people. They were about getting the work done, and they didn't really ruminate a lot. we had to go looking very closely to find any kind of emotional kind of texture, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I spoke with Jonah, he got the sense that you needed to build up Hilda as a kind of the beating heart of the piece, and that's just my phrasing. But like she was the person that you really needed to lean into because she was really spearheading this effort, as there wasn't just as much at the time left in, say, Carl's own voice. So what was the challenge in lifting her up at the center of this piece in this campaign to get the Nobel Prize awarded to Carl?
Yeah, I think part of what made her such an admirable person made her a less easy person to write about. So she really was not ego driven. Luckily, one of her best friends growing up was also a writer and captured a little bit of her in this writer's autobiography, excuse me. So I was able to get a bit of detail about her person that way, but she just was very no nonsense and wanted to get the work done and just did not dwell on herself at all. So, the one really key quote in the piece that we were able to find where she talks about how she feels towards the end of the piece, I spent 2 days reading letters in the Federal Archives in Berlin before I found it. And it was just a little footnote at the end of a letter that she'd written to Millie Zerker, where she talks about being exhausted and how hard the whole thing has been for her and how much fear she has for what's going to happen next. So yeah, I think that was probably the biggest struggle with her. In addition to the fact that she didn't leave behind any photographs, she didn't leave behind a diary. So we had a hard time even figuring out how to describe her as a person. Like, I don't know if you noticed, but there's no physical description of her because essentially there's only 2 photographs that exist of her and they're 30 years apart and being taken. So she was difficult to put on the page.
A lot of people I talk to, it's a central tenet of everything is research and reporting, and very very few people seem to have like a really good concrete system of like organizing that research, even going about the research. Things get a little messy and haphazard. If you're the ADHD stricken like me, it can get messy real fast. And you're someone who is clearly a very skilled researcher. How do you go about your research and organize it in such a way where you're not gonna lose sourcing for key details?
I don't know if I am the best person at this either. I keep one long running Google Doc with all of the things that I notice in it. And then later when I go back, I've started taking pictures of all the pages I think I want to use. Yeah, I don't have a really great or very sophisticated system. I have handwritten notes. I have a relatively decent memory, which is, probably not the best tool for a project like this either. But thankfully, I was able to remember, oh yeah, I got that detail out of this book, this book, or I remember that it was in a letter to this person. If I didn't, make a good enough footnote.
Well, when you're sitting down to write, or do you have any kind of like I don't know, a routine or a ritual around when you're going to be sitting down to write for a few hours that you like to do to like prime the pump?
I don't have any rituals. I have a day job, and I tend to have a lot of projects going on at the same time. So I don't really feel that I have the luxury at this point of being too precious about my writing process. I
Yeah.
maybe would have in college or something. Yeah, just trying to free up at least an hour at a time. I'm very deadline motivated, so I make sure I set myself deadlines, even though that can also wear you down and wear
Mm-hmm.
down your mental health if you are constantly on deadline. But yeah, I think I kind of need that accountability to write. And when I have it, then things get done.
What's the nature of your day job?
I'm the editorial director for a nonprofit organization called the Pollen Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
We we create and support media centers inside of prisons.
Mm-hmm. All right. And so when you're a lot of people who listen to the show too, are working writers or have day jobs that are divorced from the writing they like to do. So I always love being able to peel back a bit or demystify some of the things around writing. A lot of people have their 9 to 5s, and they find their writing time, their research time around that, and thread it around in whatever way possible. So, as you're doing your work with the Pollen Initiative, and you're doing some research of this nature for a piece for the Atavist, how did you thread your research and your writing around it as best you could?
I'm lucky that it is mostly a remote position, so I'm actually able to be on the road.
Mm-hmm.
Made it possible for me to travel to different archives. I also, for the most part, set my own schedule. So, when I feel like I need to get a certain number of hours done on a piece of writing, I have the flexibility to do that. And yeah, also a lot of what I do is edit and help support the writing of people who are trying to do journalism inside prisons. And so I have a very nourishing feedback loop between that kind of editorial work and my own writing, I guess you could say.
Mm. And when you say journalism inside prisons, is that are the reporters the inmates in the prisons, or is it?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, tell me a little bit about just about that. It seems like especially the power brokers inside a prison don't want to empower the voice of the people they're overlording.
It depends on where you are. I suppose every prison is probably its own world in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Some administrations are pretty supportive. Um, a lot of wardens nowadays, I think, are beginning to understand that it is easier to administer a space where there is a relatively healthy information ecosystem. So you don't want to be in charge of a space where the best source of information is the rumor mill. So prison newspapers can fill that kind of function for a prison, and people also are a lot easier to work with when they feel that they're being heard and listened to. So I think prison media fills that function too. So yeah, it's an interesting space to try and cultivate something like a free press.
Your Atavist story must have felt particularly like close to the heart, because there is this element of trying to get information from inside, the camps where your central figure is, and they're trying to get information on him, and and everything. So, in what way did this piece really feel just kind of very close to the work you do now?
That's a really great point. And actually, a lot of my thought partners inside prison who are currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated colleagues of mine have been very insightful for me trying to imagine how some of this worked. So the question of how the friends communicated with Carl von Ossietzky while he was in prison was a question that came up both in my writing and also in editing. And unfortunately, this is another one of those places where nothing is verifiable. So all we can really do is speculate. But my formerly incarcerated colleagues and friends have told me, well, often corrections officers are, motivated to get things in or out of a prison. So maybe that's how it happened. Maybe there was a form of bribery that took place, or not everyone has the same ideology who might be a guard in a space. And so they might be more sympathetic towards the people that they're looking over. And in that way, they might be willing to get a message out.
Mm.
So we had a lot of interesting conversations about the ways in which this could have taken place. Not that any of that went into the piece, as it is a fully fact-checked article, but it was really interesting to try and think about ways in which the early concentration camp system could have been a lot like an American prison.
And when you were getting, you got your information, you're starting to sit down to write. How did you go about structuring the piece, or thinking about the structure of this piece as you sat down to write it?
Well, I think I always knew that it was going to have two storylines that seemed to make a lot of sense, since part of what's interesting is to know what happened to him. So one storyline was going to follow Ossietzky through his arrest and the whole story of his imprisonment, and then the other storyline would follow, his friends and their quest to free him. So that part was clear. I think in editing, the way in which the first draft evolved into the last draft was trying to figure out how often we should toggle back and forth between those two storylines. The final version, the toggling happens quite frequently, so that we can stay closer to the timeline.
Did you kind of write through each timeline separately and then tried to braid them together?
I wrote based on buckets of reporting that I needed to do. So if I knew it was going to be something about Sonnenberg, the first prison the first Nazi-run prison that Ossietzky was at, I would do the research and I would write that piece first. And then, maybe I would go and say, okay, I need to figure out what happened in Paris. And so I'd spend a week just reading about German exiles in Paris and what their lives were like, and going through memoirs and, trying to figure out, where they all lived in the city and write that piece next. So yeah, I think that's how I moved through it. It wasn't chronological necessarily. It was more to do with how the research got lumped together.
And when you're, in your writing, in your own headspace, I think a lot of us deal with myriad manifestations of self-doubt and negative self-talk, and we still have to kind of wrestle our way and flop our way through it somehow. And for you, if that's something you experience, how do you dance with that fear or dance with that voice so you can write something that's ultimately as wonderful as this particular piece with the Atavist?
Oh, thank you. Well, I will say that this was my first try writing plot-driven historical narrative, and I'm always looking for ways to stretch myself as a writer, but obviously that's also sometimes a little intimidating. So I was just tried to keep as humble as possible, take feedback as it came from Jonah, and not be too precious about my writing. Yeah, I guess that was I tried to acknowledge very early on that I'm in a growth period and I'm learning something new, and I think that was really helpful for me.
Right. That's I know for me, oftentimes in the heat of a project, I like clockwork. We'll wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning with just all kinds of panicky manifestations and visions and hallucinations about my myriad ways of inadequacy when it comes to this nature. And I'm wondering, just for you, a lot of writers deal with that. Like, do you have a degree of that impostery syndrome thing and the self-doubt that just it seems very baked into this kind of work? Do you wrestle with that at all?
Oh, definitely, especially being someone who tries to stand with feet in different spaces. There's
Yeah.
always the chance that someone's going to say that you don't belong there. Also, I think maybe working with the writers that I do inside prison, I'm just very aware of the fact that everyone is always in a place where they could be growing all the time. So it's good to embrace the fact that you don't know everything, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That's what your reader is for, to make you better.
Yeah.
Or
And
to at
well,
least help you write the best version of your piece for that particular publication. A finished piece is a great piece.
early in your Atavist piece, I like this moment that you cited that basically what Carl said. It's journalists, he believed, ought to hold a mirror up to the times and be the conscience of the day. And that's written in a citation from someone I would think, and I'm presuming, but I'll ask you to expound, is someone who really loves journalism and sees the value of journalism. And just when you read a comment of that nature and to put it into the piece, what's your connection to journalism, journalists, and to drop that into the piece?
Yeah, that sometimes that's a little bit difficult when writing about journalism in the past, just because their conception of journalism, I think, was quite different from ours. And there were actually many times in this story where I've had to catch myself making assumptions about what I thought I knew about how things worked. And the same thing when we went through editing and fact checking. You know, sometimes you can forget that your perspective is just your perspective, and it's a historical one, and it can be hard to remind yourself that things weren't always the way they are now. And I say that because I think that journalism in the 1920s in Germany looked very, very different than it does now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they they didn't have the same kind of close attachment to like objective reporting that we do in the States and in our day and age. They were much more commentary driven anyway, but I think Carl von Ossietzky was particularly invested in commentary. So yeah, I think what made him stand out wasn't only just that he was willing to have this, I guess you could say, judgment, for lack of a better word. He did want to be the conscience of the day,
Mm-hmm.
but he was able to do it in a way that was extremely accessible. And I think that was what made him very unique. That he had a beautiful, but also very accessible writing style. And so people really could hear him when he was saying something on the page.
And when you're researching, reporting, or even writing, what part of on the continuum of this process in be it a book or article, do you feel most alive and engaged?
I just really love literary gossip. And so I think that those are when I start to get something that feels juicy to me in that kind of way, that really helps me understand the world that the people lived in and how they thought about things, and sort of the ways in which they could be catty, or when they capture a detail about someone's mannerisms. That's when I feel particularly hooked. And obviously that's not a strength of academic writing, so that's one of the things I love about historical narratives. You kind of need to go, you need to be a truffle pig and go find all of those great little concrete details, and your story actually can only be as good as the details you find. So
I'm always someone who loves getting a sense of the repertorial tools in your bag, the kind of notebooks you like, either or the pens or the pencils, and how you go about curating and gathering that information. Like, what are those things that you like at your disposal that you're comfortable with, that are in your satchel as you're heading out there in the field, so to speak?
I don't like to write on expensive paper. Always feel that I need cheap paper, so I tend to have like the cheapest lined notebooks.
Mm-hmm. Like those modeled black notebooks that are like $1 at
Yeah,
Staples.
or just yeah, exactly, that sort of thing. I write on a lot of loose pieces of paper, the backs of request slips from libraries, and I tried not to write too much on paper anymore, actually, just because I'm afraid of losing things. So I tend to put things in a Google Doc very quickly. Yeah, I like to read on paper though, so I do try and get my sources, as many as possible, in print, and I like to annotate, I like to highlight. I find it easier to find things when I go back if I've forgotten where they are, if I have kind of marked up my paper that way.
And when it comes to your writing and where you are to date in your career, what is some good advice that you've received from somebody, or like a cherished mentor, or just advice that you've just hard won over doing research and writing for years?
I really like Robert Caro's "Turn every page" line. I feel the truth in that every time I go to work on something and I'm getting nervous about the time I've invested, and I start to panic that I haven't found what I needed to make the story good. Just knowing that you just need to sit as long as you can with the sources and turn every page, and hopefully you're going to eventually find what you're looking for.
How do
Yeah,
you
what else?
know because as you've expressed, you're someone who operates well when a deadline is nearing, and Yeah, Caro's turn every page. Like I love it. That's a guy who operates on a almost geologic time scale when it comes to
This is
writing his books. And eventually it's like, yeah, sometimes you feel like, all right, yeah, I do want to turn every page, or like, oh, maybe there's another stone out there to be to be overturned, or the real nightmare scenario is not even knowing there's a certain stone to be overturned. Like, oh my God, I didn't even realize that thing existed. And now there's like thousands of pages over there. Eventually, you got to turn that faucet off. So, just for you and your experience, at what point do you feel like, all right, I gotta turn this off, and I gotta move
Mhm.
on to the next phase?
I tend to do research all the way through until the last draft, so I'm really bad about turning it off. But I think also knowing that the best writing is done writing, and trying to keep that idea in mind that there will be another piece. This isn't the sinking ship you're going to go down on. So
Hmm.
also letting go, and letting it stand, even if it's not perfect. Um, And then, actually, when I was working on my PhD, the thing that stuck with me the most was when someone told me that the real art is learning what to leave out, not what to put in.
Mm.
So I think that is a form of discernment that is really important to cultivate.
Yeah, how when it came to like this piece in particular, how hard was it to maybe leave something out that was, to use a word you used earlier in this conversation, as kind of juicy?
I got very easily distracted with the atmospheric detail in the story, and was just sort of charmed by the zany, chaotic German exile community in Paris, for example. And so I think I went down way too much of a rabbit hole with that, and was delighted by all these people that I met, and saddened and by the tragic nature of their fate, but also kind of amazed at how resourceful they were. And all of that ended up getting cut from the piece. Essentially, I think we cut out 4 paragraphs on Paris. Same thing with the Winter Olympics. The entire backdrop was very it was messy. Everything kind of went sideways, and so I had a lot of fun reading journalist accounts of all the strange things they witnessed in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Again, too distracting. Didn't it slowed down the primary action of the story, so we ended up cutting all of that. It was still fun. I don't know, hopefully I can use it again somewhere else, and
Hmm.
maybe that's another important lesson, is that, one piece might lead you to 2 more pieces later on.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and you realize that your Atavist piece is its own self-contained thing, and yeah, and a lot of that material, it might be more suited in a book, or the context of
Mhm.
that might, it'll resurface. So there is no, even though things might end up on the floor for a little bit, yeah, I think you come to an understanding that there is really no wasted work.
Yeah, I think that's true, and also not listening to your editors and what they have to say. I was really worried that this story was too highly populated with people that no one knows, and that it would be really hard for the reader to keep track of all these people. But that didn't seem to bother Jonah, so it was good to have another set of eyes on what the story needed and what it didn't.
Oh, very nice. Well, Kate, I want to be mindful of your time, and this is a really like furtive conversation about how you went about doing this piece. And I like bringing these conversations down for a landing by just asking the guest for just a recommendation for the listeners, and that can just be anything you're excited about, like a certain brand of coffee, or a brand of socks, or fanny pack. It's totally up to you. So if there's anything you'd like to recommend to the listeners out there, I'd love to hear it, as will they.
Well, in the vein of literary gossip, I think probably the books that I enjoy reading the most are by memoirists who don't have a filter. And if people are interested in this period, I can recommend Arthur Kessler. He wrote many volumes of memoir over his very long writerly life. He was a Hungarian journalist, but who wrote in German, and then after the war in English. And his stuff is pretty widely available, but he's a great read.
Mm. Very nice. And it sounds like you're fluent in German. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And did you study like in the States and study Germany, or did you grow up speaking German as well? Like, how did that come to pass?
I came about it purely through school. I was a philosophy and German major in college as an undergrad, and then had the opportunity to study overseas for a while. So I ended up getting a PhD in German studies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I've just always been really fascinated by the ways in which German thinkers have both made our world better and made it a lot worse.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a place of extremes.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. Well, fantastic. Well, Kate, this was wonderful to have this conversation and to talk about your work. So just thank you for the time, and thanks for coming on the show to talk about your Atavist piece.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
We got to go back, Kate. Awesome. That was so great. Thanks to Jonah and Kate. She has a pretty sparse website, katejoymcqueen.com, if you want to go check that out. I would. You can always follow the show on Instagram at Creative Nonfiction Podcast, or head to BrendanO'Mara.com to sign up for the up to 11 Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. All right, so this past Monday, I drove down Sunday night and got a hotel in Redding, California, about a 5-hour drive from me and Eugene. Met a guy who had some great Prefontaine family photos. Since they didn't have cooperation from the primary gatekeeper, that's what we'll call her, these photos were money to get. When you talk about gas, hotel, food, these photos cost me between $300 and $400 to obtain. Will it be worth it? I don't know. That Monday morning, I added my dedication, my epigraph, my acknowledgments, my epilogue to the main manuscript that had been reviewed for 2 weeks for the copy edits. Read the book 2 more fucking times. What does that make? 15 times that I've read this godforsaken book? I hate it. I mean, are you supposed to say that? I don't think so. Yeah, it makes me sound ungrateful. It passed the legal review, so that's something. I got a book cover, and I've seen what the interior design is going to look like. It's starting to look like a book. Not just a Word doc. I don't know if I'll share any images of the book cover or not. Writers constantly hawking their shit is exhausting, and I'm not sure I want to contribute to that space. If nothing I can do to make the book more attractive or sell better, it's just gonna. It's a living organism unto itself. I can just put it out there, this little baby bird, and say, fly. Maybe I'll share with the newsletter crew and the Patreon crew. Those are people who seem to be in on the joke. I have a hard time imagining anyone giving a shit. Like maybe Kelsey or Dale, but I don't know. Okay, I'm a bit sad. There's no fanfare. It just ends. Like a few months ago, my agent was asking me if I cracked the mystery around Steve Prefontaine's death, and I said no, and she was like, oh. Like she was so disappointed. Like you could tell, you could feel the bestseller potential of the book just drain out of the room in her estimation. You know how you can just pick up on energy? Yeah, there was serious, I thought you could, you didn't, and you, why, I guess you disappoint so many people along the way when you're writing a book that when you finally turn it in, you don't really feel that good. It's like the capstone on a long chain of many disappointments. I disappointed myself the most for not cracking the mystery, for not making 300 more interviews, for not subscribing to that extra newspaper archive when my back was really up against the deadline wall. Did I waste a lot of time? Yeah, I think so. Did I complain that I wouldn't have enough time? Sure, that was part of wasting it. Did I work as hard as I possibly could? I don't know, maybe. Probably not. Did I blow it? Most likely. I'll likely never get this opportunity again. It just sucks that I had the best editor in the world. The world. The best circumstances to write a book in the world. And it's likely going to be a dud and perhaps my final crack at something of this scale. I mean, what the fuck is wrong with me? I'm very sorry. Debilitating ADHD, of which I need to get medicated for. Jesus Christ. The Adderall I was on at one point a few years ago made me feel like a fucking hummingbird. I think my heart was beating as fast as a hummingbird, and I had next to no appetite, which meant I wasn't such a chubby fat fuck. I'm just a sad, broken dude. Maybe this is how you feel after finishing a book. I guess that's why I'll be starting research on a new one next week, because I will sit for a few more days with the darkness, and then I got to get out of the darkness. It's been 14 years since I last published a book. Like back then, 2010, 2011, when I was 30, 31, I felt more hopeful, naturally. You have more runway ahead of you, in theory. Now, 44 going on to 45 by the time this book comes out. I'm just this ungrateful husk, an insufferable waste of your time. The analytics bear it out. I'm going to go for a walk. That's what I'm going to do. Then I'm going to lift some weights and hope not to injure this brittle, broken body. For those of you writing a book, this is what you might have to look forward to when you turn it in. Fuck all of us, and if you can do interviews, see ya.